The sky over England turned a deep, foreboding red on a cold February night in 1208. The moon, usually a beacon of light, appeared as a blood-soaked orb, casting an eerie glow across the land. People stared in awe and fear, whispering that it was a sign of doom. Little did they know, the true terror was about to descend from the halls of power. King John, the son of the mighty Henry II, now ruled over a kingdom that was a shadow of its former glory. He had lost vast territories in France and was left with England, the Channel Islands, and a small slice of Aquitaine. Unlike his predecessors, John was forced to stay in his kingdom, a restless and aggressive king who never seemed to rest. He was always on the move, traveling from castle to castle, from manor to hunting lodge, his vast court in tow. John was a king who cared deeply about luxury and display. He took regular baths, a rarity in those times, and his household was known for its opulence. But beneath the finery, there was a ruthless ruler. John wanted to know his kingdom intimately, and he was determined to enforce his will at every turn. His court was a massive caravan of carts and packhorses, stretching for hundreds of yards, carrying everything from bed linen to precious jewels. The king's chapel and dining room could be set up anywhere, and the court moved 20 miles a day, leaving a trail of mud and awe in its wake. John was not just a king of luxury, he was a king of law. His early education under the tutelage of Ranulph Glanville, a leading legal thinker, had instilled in him a deep interest in justice. He was a hands-on king, often sitting in court to hear cases, from the smallest disputes to the most significant. He showed mercy when it was due, like when he gave a reprieve to a little boy who had accidentally killed a friend with a stone. But he was also relentless in his pursuit of justice, sometimes at the expense of the wealthy and powerful. The king's court was not just a spectacle, it was a judicial circuit. As John traveled, he brought his legal team with him, and they heard cases wherever they went. This was a significant departure from previous kings, who had often left such matters to their deputies. John was determined to be involved in every aspect of his kingdom's governance, but ruling with an iron fist came at a cost. After the death of Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1205, John felt a new sense of power. He declared, "Now, for the first time, I am King of England." He gathered a new set of advisors, some of whom were foreigners, reflecting his own roots in the lost French territories. These men, like Peter Desroches and Peter de Mauley, brought a different flavor to the court, but English-born officials still held high positions. John's primary goal was to raise money. He needed vast sums to fund his campaigns to regain his lost territories. He levied taxes with a vigor that was evident to all. In 1207, he imposed a tax of 1 shilling in every mark on the country's movable goods, raising an astonishing £57,425 more than 2 years' worth of revenue. This was a sign of England's wealth and the king's ability to tap into it. John also used the legal system to his advantage. He charged high fees for legal proceedings, and wealthy litigants often paid large bribes for favorable judgment. He raised the costs of feudal incidents, such as the fines paid for a son's knighthood or a daughter's marriage, to new heights. When the earldom of Leicester was left vacant, John seized the lands, citing non-payment of debt. This was a clear sign that he was more interested in wealth than in protecting the property of his subjects. The king's financial demands grew more urgent, and there was no sign of them abating. On October 1st, 1207, John's young wife, Isabella of Angoulême, gave birth to a baby boy at Winchester Castle. The child was named Henry, after John's grandfather, who had once ruled over a vast empire. This birth was a powerful signal of John's intentions, to raise the money needed to reclaim all that his father had won. As the moon turned blood red, the people of England braced themselves for what was to come. King John was a master of his realm, and his rule would be both cruel and relentless. The kingdom was about to face a new and terrifying chapter. John, the King of England, was in a fierce battle with the Church. He wanted to choose his own archbishop for Canterbury, but the chapter of clerics there, who had the ancient right to elect the new archbishop, picked their own man, Reginald, instead of John's choice, Grey. John tried to force the chapter to select Grey, which made Pope Innocent III, a strong and reforming pope, very angry. The pope overturned Grey's election, rejected Reginald, and chose his own candidate, Stephen Langton. to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Langton was a pious and talented scholar, and Innocent consecrated him in Rome in 1207. When John found out, he was furious. He sent angry letters to Rome, threatened to block travel to the papacy from his ports, and expelled the monks of Canterbury from England. He declared Langton an enemy and took control of the archbishop's possessions. In response, Pope Innocent placed the entire country of England under an interdict, which meant that almost all church services were banned, and people were cut off from religious activities. Only a few essential services, like baptisms and the anointing of the dying, were allowed. John's reaction was intense. He was so angry that he reportedly went mad with fury, cursing and swearing. But he was also a clever king. He ordered his officers to seize the church's property, leaving the clergy without their land or income. The king then allowed the clergy to buy back their property, but only if they paid a large portion of their wealth to him. John even took the wives, concubines, and mistresses of the clergy as hostages and ransomed them back, collecting even more money from the church. Despite the interdict, John's actions brought a lot of money into the royal treasury. However, his disregard for the church's authority had consequences. In 1209, Pope Innocent excommunicated John, which meant that the king was officially cut off from the church. This was a severe punishment because it encouraged other Christian kings to attack England without fear of being condemned by the Pope. Yet no invasion came, and John continued to benefit from the excommunication. When bishops and abbacies became empty, their wealth went to the crown. John didn't stop there. He also turned his attention to the Jews, who were wealthy and had a monopoly on moneylending. He imposed a heavy tax on them known as a tallage and demanded a large sum of money. When the Jews couldn't pay, they were persecuted and tortured. One Jew in Bristol was subjected to having a tooth knocked out every day until he paid a huge sum of 10,000 marks. John's most notorious campaign was against the Briouzes family. William de Briouzes was a powerful baron who had served John and his brother Richard. He had accumulated significant wealth and lands, but by 1208, John saw him as a potential threat. John demanded that Briouzes pay a large debt and provide hostages. When Briouzes' wife, Matilda, insulted John by accusing him of murdering his nephew, Arthur, John's anger intensified. He began to strip the Briouzes family of their lands and positions, and when they tried to fight back, he forced them to flee to Ireland. William de Briouzes sought refuge with William Marshal, a powerful lord in Ireland. However, John was determined to bring Ireland under his control and prevent it from becoming a haven for his enemies. He invaded Ireland in 1210, imposing English laws and customs and crushing his opponents. The Briouzes family was eventually captured, and Matilda and her son were starved to death in a castle. William de Briouzes escaped to France, where he revealed the truth about Arthur's death to the French court. By the end of 1210, John had established his authority across England, Ireland, and Scotland. His enemies were either dead or in hiding, and his treasury was full. However, the silence of the church bells and the stories of his cruelty spread fear among his subjects. John's power was absolute, but the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. In the year 1212, a hermit named Peter of Wakefield had a vision. He claimed that King John's reign would end before the next Ascension Day, which fell in May 1213. This prophecy spread quickly, and many people believed it. When the news reached King John, he laughed at first, but then became worried. He had Peter arrested and brought to court. The king asked Peter if he would die on that day, or how he would lose his throne. Peter bravely replied that the king would not be king on that day, and if he was wrong, he would accept any punishment. Despite being locked up in Corfe Castle, Peter's prophecy continued to spread. King John, who had been enjoying a series of successes, found this unsettling. He had just returned from a successful campaign in Ireland, where he had subdued the Irish kings and expanded English control over Wales. He had also secured the support of the Scottish king, William the Lion, by taking hostages and providing military aid. With all this success, John felt confident and wealthy, with a vast treasury and enough money to plan a new invasion of Normandy. However, the situation quickly turned against him. In the summer of 1212, a rebellion broke out in northern Wales. The Welsh, angered by John's aggressive castle building, launched guerrilla attacks on English border castles. The king was forced to abandon his plans for invading France and focus on suppressing the Welsh rebellion. He even hanged 28 Welsh hostages in Nottingham to show his anger, but this only made things worse. To add to his troubles, King John learned of a plot against his life. Some of his barons, including Eustace de Vesci and Robert Fitzwalter, were planning to kill him and replace him with a new king. When the plot was uncovered, de Vesci fled to Scotland, and Fitzwalter escaped to France. Only one plotter, Geoffrey of Norwich, was caught and died in prison. This discovery made John paranoid, and he began to distrust his barons. He disbanded his Welsh army, put royal castles on high alert, and demanded hostages from the barons to ensure their loyalty. John's relationship with his barons had been deteriorating for a long time. He was known for his cruel and unpredictable behavior, such as the way he treated the Briouzes family, which had shocked many nobles. His governance style, which was highly centralized and professional, also reduced the power of the barons. Royal officials, often foreigners or low-born men, were taking over roles that the barons once controlled. This made the barons feel marginalized and resentful. Despite these tensions, John continued to prepare for his invasion of Normandy. He spent large sums of money recruiting mercenaries and building alliances with other European leaders. In May 1213, his half-brother William de Longespie led a successful naval attack on the French fleet at the port of Dam. The French had been planning an invasion of England, and the attack destroyed hundreds of ships and a vast amount of supplies. King Philip II of France, upon seeing the destruction, was enraged and ordered the remaining ships to be burned. This victory was a significant blow to the French, and secured England's safety for several years. However, it did not solve the growing issues at home. King John's relationship with his barons remained strained, and the seeds of rebellion were already taking root. The king's next move would be crucial, as he needed to balance his foreign ambitions with the growing discontent in his own kingdom. King John returned to England after his defeat at Betrayal, feeling more vulnerable than ever. Before the battle, he had been a powerful king with vast lands in France. Now he was left with only a small part of his former territory's Gascony and the area around Bordeaux. The loss was a huge blow, both to his pride and to his finances. He had spent a fortune preparing for the campaign, and now he had nothing to show for it. Back in England, the barons were already unhappy. They had been grumbling about John's harsh methods and heavy taxes for years. Now, with John weakened, their complaints grew louder. They wanted to put limits on the king's power, to make sure he couldn't misuse it again. They remembered the Charter of Liberties, a document from over a century ago, when Henry I promised to rule fairly and justly. The barons believed John should live up to those same standards. In the winter of 1214 to 1215, John and the barons met twice to try and resolve their differences. But John just stalled, writing to the Pope for help. The barons, feeling ignored, decided to take matters into their own hands. They sent their own letters to the Pope, asking him to make John follow the Charter of Liberties. The Pope, however, sided with John, telling the barons to pay their taxes and stop making demands. This only made the barons more determined to stand up to the king. On May 5, 1215, a group of barons formally defied John. They renounced their loyalty to him, effectively rejecting him as their king. The rebellion was led by Eustace de Vesci and Robert Fitzwalter, who called himself the Marshal of the Army of God. These barons were from the north, a tight-knit group with personal reasons to dislike John. They were joined by barons from East Anglia and the home counties, including Richard de Clare and his son Gilbert, Geoffrey de Manville, and others. These men had different reasons for rebelling, but they all agreed that the king's government needed reform. Once they renounced their loyalty, the barons knew they had to act quickly. They raced to London, a city of great importance. Whoever controlled London had a strong hold on the country. The city was wealthy, well-defended, and a center of trade and power. If the barons could take London, they would have a strong base to fight from. John tried to stop them, offering to submit to arbitration and promising not to seize their lands, but the barons rejected his terms. On May 12th, John ordered the confiscation of the rebel lands, and the country slid into civil war. The barons, led by Fitzwalter, reached London first and took control of the city. With London in their hands, the barons felt they had a real chance to force John to make changes. The stage was set for a showdown. John, now a weakened and unpopular king, faced a group of determined barons who were ready to fight for their rights. The battle for England had begun. The sun was setting on King John's reign as he breathed his last in Newark, Nottinghamshire, on October 19, 1216. His body, not taken to the grand font of Rod where his family rested, was laid to eternal sleep in Worcester Cathedral, near the altar of St. Wulfstan, an ancient Saxon bishop who had been sainted during John's own reign. John, a king who had faced more challenges and betrayals than triumphs, left behind a legacy that would forever be etched in the annals of English history, but not as he might have wished. John's rule was marred by tyranny, conflict, and the loss of vast territories. He had alienated many of his barons, who, fed up with his arbitrary and cruel governance, forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. This document, which aimed to limit the powers of the king and protect the rights of the barons, was more than just a peace treaty. It was a symbol of the struggle between the crown and the nobility. Though it failed to bring lasting peace, the Magna Carta would go on to become one of the most influential documents in English history, setting the stage for future constitutional battles. As John's reign crumbled, the barons turned to Prince Louis of France, inviting him to invade England and depose the unpopular king. Louis landed in Kent, was welcomed into London, and advanced through the country, besieging key fortresses. John, already weakened by illness and the loss of his baggage train in the Wash, died a broken man, his kingdom in turmoil. With John's death, the future of the Plantagenet dynasty hung in the balance. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, was hastily crowned in Gloucester Abbey, far from the rebels who controlled Westminster. The ceremony was a simple affair, lacking the grandeur and pageantry of a typical coronation. Henry, a solemn and pious child, swore to uphold the duties of a king, to protect the church, and to bring justice to his people. But the real power lay with the papal legate, Cardinal Gualabicuri, to whom Henry paid homage, placing England under the protection of the church. The road ahead was fraught with danger. French knights occupied castles across the land, and the country was deeply divided. The young king's reign would be a test of strength, not just of legitimacy. The barons who had rebelled against John were now faced with the prospect of a child king, and the question of whether they would support Henry or continue to back Louis of France loomed large. As Henry III took the throne, the legacy of his father's reign cast a long shadow. The Magna Carta, though initially a failure, would be reissued and gain legendary status, becoming a cornerstone of English constitutional law. The young king's reign would be defined by the struggle to rebuild a fractured kingdom and to honor the promises made in that historic document. The future was uncertain, but the spirit of the Magna Carta would guide the way, setting the stage for the development of a more just and balanced form of governance in England.